The old school bus pulled up to the front gates of Riverside Academy with a loud screech of brakes. Inside, a 14-year-old boy named David pressed his face against the foggy window and stared at the massive brick building in front of him. The school looked like something from a movie. Tall white columns, perfectly cut grass, and students walking around in crisp uniforms that probably cost more than his family spent on clothes in a year. David wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and grabbed his worn backpack from the seat beside him. This was it, his first day at one of the most expensive private schools in the state. He was only here because of a scholarship he had won for his amazing grades. But looking at this place made him feel like he was about to walk into a different world. The bus door opened with a hiss, and David stepped out onto the smooth pavement. Other students were getting dropped off by their parents in shiny cars that looked like they belonged in a showroom. Mercedes, BMW, Tesla. David had only seen cars like these on TV. He watched as perfectly dressed kids hugged their parents goodbye and walked confidently toward the school entrance like they owned the place. David pulled his old jacket tighter around himself and started walking. His sneakers, which had seemed fine that morning, now looked old and beat up compared to the expensive shoes everyone else was wearing. He tried to walk with confidence, but inside his stomach was doing flips. The main hallway was huge, with marble, floors so shiny David could see his reflection in them. Students moved in groups, laughing and talking about their summer vacations to places David had only heard about on the news. He heard bits of conversations about trips to Europe, new cars for birthdays, and weekend houses by the lake. David found his locker and fumbled with the combination. Behind him, he could hear whispers and felt eyes watching him. He pretended not to notice, but his hands shook as he tried to open the metal door. When it finally clicked open, he quickly shoved his books inside and grabbed what he needed for his first class. His first few classes went okay. The teachers seemed nice enough, and David was smart. He had always been at the top of his class at his old school. But he could feel the differences everywhere. When students talked about their weekend plans, David stayed quiet. When they complained about their allowances being cut to only $200 a week, David almost choked on his water. During lunch, David sat alone at a table near the back of the huge cafeteria. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, but none of it included him. He opened his brown bag lunch, a peanut butter sandwich his mom had packed that morning, and tried to eat quietly while other students lined up to buy gourmet meals that cost more than his family spent on groceries in a day. That's when he heard it. Music. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing piano. The sound drifted through the hallways like a gentle breeze, and David found himself drawn to it like a magnet. He had always loved music, especially piano. His grandmother had taught him to play on the old upright piano at her church, and some of his happiest memories were of sitting beside her on that creaky bench, learning to make beautiful sounds with his fingers. David finished his sandwich quickly and followed the sound down a long hallway lined with paintings of former school principals. The music got louder as he walked, and soon he found himself standing outside a room with a sign that read Music Department. Through the open door, David could see the most beautiful piano he had ever laid eyes on. It was a massive black grand piano that gleamed under the bright lights. The sound coming from it was rich and powerful, nothing like the tinny old piano at his grandmother's church. A student with perfectly styled blonde hair was playing what sounded like a complicated classical piece, her fingers moving across the keys like she had been born to play. David stood in the doorway, completely mesmerized. He had never seen a piano like this in real life, and the sound it made was incredible. Without thinking, he took a step into the room to get a better look. "Excuse me." The voice behind him was sharp and cold. David spun around to see a tall woman with gray hair, pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a dark blue dress and had the kind of expression that made David feel like he had just been caught stealing. "Students are not allowed in the music room during lunch unless they are enrolled in music classes." "Oh, I'm sorry," David said quickly, his face heating up with embarrassment. "I just heard the music and wanted to see." "This is not a public space for wandering students," the woman interrupted. Her name tag read, "Mrs. Wellington, Music Department Head." She looked David up and down, taking in his old clothes and worn sneakers. "These instruments are very expensive and delicate. They're not toys for students to play around with. David felt his cheeks burn. I wasn't going to touch anything. I just wanted to listen. Well, you've listened. Now please find somewhere more appropriate to spend your lunch period. Mrs. Wellington's voice was firm and final. She gestured toward the door like she was shooing away a stray dog. As David walked away, he heard Mrs. Wellington talking to another teacher who had appeared beside her. We really need to be more careful about who we let wander the halls, she said in a voice just loud enough for David to hear. Some of these scholarship students don't understand boundaries. David's face burned with shame and anger as he walked back down the hallway. He had been at the school for exactly 4 hours, and already he felt like an outsider. The beautiful music that had drawn him to the room now felt like something that was meant for other people. People who belonged in a place like this. For the rest of that week, David avoided the music room completely. But every day during lunch, he could hear that piano calling to him. Sometimes it was classical music, sometimes jazz, sometimes pop songs that had been arranged for piano. Each time he heard it, his fingers would move slightly, remembering the songs his grandmother had taught him years ago. By Friday, David had started to find his rhythm at Riverside Academy. His grades were excellent as always, and a few students had even started talking to him in class. But he still felt the invisible walls that separated him from his classmates. When they talked about their plans for the weekend, David would make up excuses about why he couldn't join them, knowing that whatever they had planned probably cost more money than his family had. During his last lunch period of the week, David decided to be brave. He had seen Mrs. Wellington leave the music room earlier, and the sound of piano music had stopped. Maybe, just maybe, he could take a quick look at that beautiful instrument up close. Just for a minute. David walked down the familiar hallway, his heart pounding with each step. The music room door was slightly open, and he could see the grand piano sitting there like a sleeping giant. He looked both ways to make sure no one was watching, then slipped quietly into the room. Up close, the piano was even more incredible than he had imagined. The black surface was so polished he could see his reflection in it, and the keys looked like perfect white and black teeth waiting to sing. David stood there for a moment, just staring at the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen, wondering what it would feel like to make music on something so perfect. He had no idea that this moment, standing alone in that music room, dreaming of playing that incredible piano, would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since David's first day at Riverside Academy, and things had gotten a little easier. He had learned to navigate the hallways without feeling completely lost, and his teachers seemed impressed with his work. But the invisible walls were still there, reminding him every day that he was different from the other students. David had started bringing his lunch to the library instead of the cafeteria. It was quieter there, and he didn't have to watch other kids talk about things he couldn't afford to do. Plus, from his favorite table by the window, he could still hear the faint sound of piano music drifting from the music room down the hall. Every day, the music called to him. His fingers would tap silently on the table, remembering the melodies his grandmother had taught him. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine himself sitting at that beautiful grand piano, making music that filled the whole school. But every time he walked past the music room, Mrs. Wellington seemed to appear out of nowhere, watching him with suspicious eyes. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. David was sitting in his first period English class when the principal's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good morning, students and faculty. I have an exciting announcement about our upcoming spring showcase, which will be held this Friday, in the main auditorium." David looked up from his notebook. He had heard about the spring showcase from other students. It was apparently a big deal where kids showed off their talents in front of the whole school. "This year's theme is Hidden Talents," the principal continued. "We want to celebrate the amazing abilities that might be hiding right here in our halls. Teachers, please encourage your students to participate. We want to see what wonderful surprises our Riverside family has to offer." After the announcement, David's English teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, smiled at the class. "What a great opportunity for you all. I hope some of you will consider participating. You might surprise yourselves with what you can do. David sank lower in his seat. The last thing he wanted was to get up in front of the entire school and make himself even more of an outsider than he already was. He spent the rest of the morning hoping the showcase would just pass by without anyone noticing him. But during lunch, as David sat in his usual spot in the library, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Wellington was talking to two other teachers at a table near the reference section. They were speaking quietly, but the library was so silent that David could hear every word. "I think it would be perfect for the showcase," Mrs. Wellington was saying. "A real lesson about knowing your place." "Are you sure about this, Helen?" asked Mr. Thompson, the math teacher. "It seems a bit harsh." "Harsh?" Mrs. Wellington's voice had an edge to it. "The boy has been lurking around my music room for weeks. He clearly thinks he can just waltz in there and play with instruments worth more than his family makes in a year. This showcase is the perfect opportunity to show him, and everyone else, why some students should stick to what they know." David's hands started shaking. They were talking about him, he was sure of it. "But what if he actually refuses to play?" asked Mrs. Peterson, the science teacher. Mrs. Wellington laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound. "Even better. Either way, he'll learn his lesson. These scholarship students need to understand that just because they're here doesn't mean they belong here." David felt sick to his stomach. He quietly packed up his things and left the library, his mind racing. He had no idea what Mrs. Wellington was planning, but he knew it wasn't good. The rest of the week passed in a blur of anxiety. David tried to act normal in his classes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. He avoided the music room completely and tried to stay out of Mrs. Wellington's sight. Friday morning arrived gray and cloudy, matching David's mood perfectly. The spring showcase was scheduled for the last period of the day, and all morning students were buzzing with excitement about the performances they would see. During lunch, David sat in the library again, picking at his sandwich and trying to calm his nerves. Maybe Mrs. Wellington had forgotten about whatever she was planning. Maybe he was worrying about nothing. But when the final bell rang and students started making their way to the auditorium, David knew his hope was misplaced. As he walked down the hallway with the crowd, he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. "David?" Mrs. Wellington's voice was honey-sweet, but her grip was tight. "Just the student I was looking for." David turned around slowly, his heart pounding. Mrs. Wellington was standing there with her usual tight smile, but her eyes were cold. "I have wonderful news," she continued, loud enough for other students nearby to hear. "I've entered you in the spring showcase. You're going to play piano for us." David felt the blood drain from his face. What? I didn't sign up for anything." "Oh, but you don't need to sign up," Mrs. Wellington said, her voice getting louder. More students were stopping to listen now. "You see, I've noticed how interested you've been in our music room, always hanging around, always listening. Clearly, you must have some musical talent you'd like to share with us." "I don't," David started, but Mrs. Wellington cut him off. "Nonsense. A boy who spends so much time around our piano department must be eager to show what he can do. I've already put your name on the list." She held up a clipboard with a triumphant smile. "You're performing right after the string quartet." By now, a small crowd of students had gathered around them. David could feel their eyes on him, some curious, some amused. He wanted to disappear into the floor. "Mrs. Wellington, I really don't think—" He tried again. "I insist," she said firmly. "Unless, of course, you were just pretending to be interested in music. Surely someone who's been so fascinated by our instruments wouldn't pass up this opportunity." David was trapped, and he knew it. If he refused, he would look like a fraud in front of everyone. If he agreed, he would probably embarrass himself on stage. Either way, Mrs. Wellington would get what she wanted. Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Wonderful." Mrs. Wellington clapped her hands together. "I'll make sure you have access to our beautiful grand piano. I can't wait to see what you can do with a real instrument." As the crowd dispersed and students headed into the auditorium, David stood frozen in the hallway. His hands were shaking, and he felt like he might throw up. In less than an hour, he would be standing on stage in front of 400 students and teachers, expected to play a piano he had never even touched. Mrs. Wellington leaned close to him as she walked past. "Break a leg," she whispered, and David could hear the satisfaction in her voice. David made his way into the auditorium on unsteady legs. The huge room was packed with excited students and proud teachers. On stage, the beautiful grand piano sat waiting under the bright lights like a sleeping giant. As David found a seat in the back row, he tried to think of what he could possibly play. His grandmother had taught him simple hymns and a few classical pieces, but nothing that would sound impressive on a stage like this. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the feeling of sitting beside her at the old church piano, her gentle hands guiding his fingers across the worn keys. The lights dimmed and the showcase began. David watched as student after student took the stage, each one more talented and confident than the last. There was a violin solo that brought tears to people's eyes, a poetry reading that made everyone laugh, and a dance performance that earned a standing ovation. With each act, David's stomach twisted tighter. Soon it would be his turn to walk up those steps and sit at that piano, in front of all these people who already saw him as an outsider. Mrs. Wellington sat in the front row with the other teachers, occasionally glancing back at David with that same cold smile. The string quartet finished their piece to thunderous applause, and David's heart nearly stopped when he heard the student announcer say the words he had been dreading. "Our next performer is David Johnson, who will be playing piano for us today." 400 pairs of eyes turned to look at him as he stood up on shaking legs. This was it. There was no backing down now. David took a deep breath and started the long walk down the aisle toward the stage, toward the piano, toward whatever was waiting for him under those bright lights. The auditorium felt like it stretched on forever as David walked down the aisle. Each step echoed in the huge space, and he could feel hundreds of eyes following his every move. Some students whispered to each other, probably wondering who this kid was and why they had never seen him perform before. David's legs felt like jelly as he climbed the steps to the stage. The bright lights were blinding, making it hard to see the faces in the audience, but he could feel their attention like a weight on his shoulders. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Wellington's voice cutting through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, David will be performing on our beautiful Steinway grand piano today. This is quite an honor, as this instrument is usually reserved for our most advanced music students." David wanted to turn around and run, but his feet carried him forward across the stage. The piano looked even more massive under the stage lights, its black surface gleaming like a mirror. He had dreamed of playing an instrument like this, but not like this, not as some kind of cruel joke. He pulled out the piano bench and sat down slowly. The auditorium was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His hands were shaking as he placed them on his knees, staring down at the pristine keys that seemed to glow under the lights. David closed his eyes for a moment and tried to remember what his grandmother had always told him when he got nervous. "Music isn't about the piano, baby. It's about what's in your heart. You just let that heart talk through your fingers and everything else will fall into place." He could almost smell her perfume and feel her gentle hand on his shoulder. She had passed away 2 years ago, but sitting at this piano, David felt closer to her than he had in months. All those afternoons spent at the old church piano, learning to play the hymns she loved so much. All those times she had encouraged him to keep practicing, even when his fingers stumbled over the difficult parts. David opened his eyes and looked out at the audience. In the front row, Mrs. Wellington sat with her arms crossed, that satisfied, smile still playing on her lips. She was waiting for him to fail, to prove whatever point she was trying to make. But as David stared at her, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his grandmother, who had believed in him when no one else did. This was about every kid who had ever been told they didn't belong somewhere. This was about proving that talent didn't care about your address or the brand of shoes you wore. David placed his fingers on the keys and felt the smooth, cool surface beneath his fingertips. The piano was perfectly tuned, so different from the old church piano that had missing keys and stuck pedals. For a moment he just sat there, feeling the potential of this incredible instrument. Then he began to play. He started with something simple, a gentle melody his grandmother had taught him years ago. It was a spiritual she used to sing while cooking Sunday dinner, and David had learned to play it by ear. The notes rang out clear and pure in the silent auditorium, and David felt some of his nervousness melt away. But after a few measures, something amazing happened. David felt the music take hold of him in a way it never had before. This piano responded to his touch like a living thing, bringing out colors and emotions in the music that he had never been able to create on the old church piano. Without thinking, David began to add more complex harmonies. His left hand found a walking bass line while his right hand danced over the melody. The simple spiritual began to transform into something rich and sophisticated, like jazz and classical music had somehow found a way to dance together. In the audience, people stopped whispering. Mrs. Wellington's smug smile began to fade as the music filled every corner of the auditorium. This wasn't what she had expected. This wasn't the embarrassing fumbling of an amateur. David felt the music flowing through him like electricity. Years of practice on that old church piano had built strength and flexibility in his fingers that he hadn't even realized he possessed. All those hours of listening to different kinds of music, classical, jazz, gospel, blues, were coming together in this one perfect moment. He transitioned seamlessly into a piece by Chopin that he had taught himself from an old book he found at the library. His fingers flew over the keys with increasing confidence, bringing out the delicate beauty of the melody while adding his own personal touches. The music seemed to paint pictures in the air, stories of struggle and hope, of dreams that refused to die. The auditorium was completely silent except for the sound of the piano. Students who had been checking their phones were now sitting forward in their seats, completely captured by what they were hearing. Teachers who had been grading papers had stopped to listen. Even the janitor who had been cleaning in the back of the room had put down his mop and was staring at the stage in amazement. David could feel the audience's energy changing. What had started as curious indifference was becoming something else entirely. He could sense their surprise, their growing appreciation, their complete attention. For the first time since starting at Riverside Academy, David felt like he truly belonged somewhere. As the Chopin piece reached its climax, David's confidence soared. He had never played in front of an audience this large, but the piano seemed to be encouraging him, responding to his every touch with rich, beautiful sound. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "Let that heart talk through your fingers." Without pause, David moved into a jazz arrangement of a popular song that was playing on the radio. He had figured out the chords by ear and had been playing around with different versions of it at his grandmother's church. But on this piano, with its perfect action and incredible sound, the arrangement came alive in ways he had never imagined. His left hand laid down a sophisticated rhythm while his right hand improvised around the melody, adding runs and flourishes that would have made professional jazz pianists proud. The music swung and danced, making several students in the audience tap their feet without even realizing it. Mrs. Wellington was no longer smiling. Her face had gone pale, and she was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. This was not going according to plan. This boy, this scholarship student she had tried to humiliate, was playing at a level that surpassed most of her advanced students. David built the jazz piece to an exciting climax, then brought it down to a gentle, contemplative ending. But he wasn't finished yet. Something inside him wanted to share one more piece of his heart with this audience that had given him such attention and respect. He began to play a melody he had written himself, inspired by all the music his grandmother had shared with him over the years. It started quietly, like a whispered prayer, then grew into something powerful and moving. The music told the story of a boy who had lost someone he loved, who had struggled to find his place in the world, but who had never given up on his dreams. As the final notes rang out in the auditorium, David lifted his hands from the keys and sat in the sudden silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The last note seemed to hang in the air like a question. Then the applause started. It began with one person clapping, then another, then suddenly the entire auditorium erupted. Students leaped to their feet, shouting and cheering. Teachers stood and applauded with genuine amazement on their faces. The sound was deafening. washing over David like a wave of acceptance and appreciation he had never experienced before. David stood up from the piano bench on shaking legs, hardly able to believe what had just happened. The boy who had walked onto this stage expecting to be humiliated was now receiving a standing ovation from 400 people who had just witnessed something truly special. The applause seemed to go on forever. David stood on the stage completely overwhelmed by the sound of 400 people cheering for him. His legs felt weak, and for a moment he thought he might actually faint. This was the opposite of everything he had expected when he walked onto this stage just 20 minutes ago. Students were whistling and shouting his name. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Even the tough-looking seniors who usually acted too cool for school events were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically. David had never experienced anything like this in his entire life. From the corner of his eye, he could see Mrs. Wellington still sitting in her chair in the front row. She wasn't clapping. Her face was bright red and she looked like she had just swallowed something bitter. The other teachers around her were applauding and talking excitedly among themselves, but Mrs. Wellington sat frozen, staring at David, with a mixture of shock and anger. Principal Roberts walked onto the stage with a huge smile on his face. He was a tall, friendly man who always made a point of greeting students in the hallways, and David had liked him from the first day of school. "Ladies and gentlemen," Principal Roberts said into the microphone, his voice filled with genuine excitement, "I think we can all agree that was absolutely incredible." The applause started up again, even louder than before. Principal Roberts waited for it to die down before continuing. "David, that was truly extraordinary. In my 20 years as an educator, I have rarely heard such beautiful, soulful music from someone so young." He turned to face David directly. "Would you mind telling us where you learned to play like that?" David's mouth felt dry as sand. He had never spoken into a microphone before, and his voice came out shaky and quiet. My grandmother taught me, at her church." "Your grandmother must be very proud of you," Principal Roberts said warmly. David's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away. "She passed away 2 years ago, sir, but I think she would be proud." The auditorium fell completely silent. Even the students who had been fidgeting in their seats were perfectly still. There was something about David's simple, honest words that touched everyone in the room. "I'm sure she is proud," Principal Roberts said gently. "Music like that doesn't come from lessons alone. It comes from the heart, and it's clear that your grandmother passed something very special on to you." As David walked off the stage, students reached out to pat his back and shake his hand. People who had never spoken to him before were telling him how amazing his performance was. A group of girls from his English class were actually crying and telling him it was the most beautiful music they had ever heard. "Dude, that was insane," said Kevin, a popular kid from David's math class who had never even looked at him before. "Where did you learn to play jazz like that?" I listened to a lot of music," David said, still not quite believing this was really happening. "You have to audition for the school jazz band," said another student. "Mr. Patterson would flip if he heard you play." David made his way back to his seat, but students kept stopping him to talk. Everyone wanted to know about his music, where he had learned to play, what other instruments he could play. For the first time since starting at Riverside Academy, David felt like he was part of something instead of just watching from the outside. But the best moment came after the showcase was over. As students were filing out of the auditorium, chattering excitedly about all the performances they had seen, David was putting on his jacket when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned around to see an elderly man with kind eyes and gray hair. David recognized him as Dr. Anderson, the music theory teacher who everyone said was a genius. "Young man," Dr. Anderson said, his voice serious but warm, "I need to talk to you." David's heart skipped a beat. Had he done something wrong? Had he somehow broken some rule by playing without permission? "David, in 40 years of teaching music, I have never heard a student play with such natural musicality." Dr. Anderson continued, "Your technique is impressive, but more importantly, you have something that can't be taught. You have soul." David didn't know what to say. Dr. Anderson was one of the most respected music teachers in the state. Students from all over the country came to Riverside Academy just to study with him. I want you to consider joining our advanced music program, Dr. Anderson said. I know you're not officially enrolled in any music classes, but I think we can work something out. Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. I don't know if I can afford the extra fees, David said quietly, his face burning with embarrassment. Dr. Anderson waved his hand dismissively. Don't worry about that. There are scholarship programs for exceptional students. What matters is that you keep developing this gift you have. As Dr. Anderson walked away, David stood in the empty auditorium still trying to process everything that had happened. An hour ago, he had been the outsider, the scholarship kid who didn't belong. Now, one of the most important teachers in the school was talking about scholarships and special programs, but the day's surprises weren't over yet. David was walking toward his locker when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around to see Mrs. Wellington approaching and his stomach dropped. She still looked angry, but there was something else in her expression now, too. David, she said, her voice much quieter than usual. I need to speak with you. David braced himself for whatever was coming. Maybe she was going to yell at him for showing off or accuse him of somehow cheating. But instead, Mrs. Wellington stopped in front of him and did something David never expected. She looked down at the floor, took a deep breath, and when she looked back up, her eyes were filled with shame. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What I did today was wrong. I was trying to embarrass you, and that was completely inappropriate. David stared at her, not knowing what to say. He had never seen Mrs. Wellington look anything but confident and in control. I made assumptions about you based on things that had nothing to do with your character or your abilities, she continued. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and I'm deeply sorry. Mrs. Wellington paused, seeming to struggle with her words. Your performance today was exceptional. You have a rare gift, and I should have recognized that instead of trying to diminish it. David found his voice. Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Wellington. I hope you'll consider joining our music program, she said. I know Dr. Anderson has already spoken to you about it. Despite what happened today, I want you to know that you would be welcome in my classes. As Mrs. Wellington walked away, David leaned against his locker and let out a long breath. The day had been like a roller coaster, full of emotions he had never experienced before. Fear, humiliation, triumph, acceptance, and now forgiveness. Students were still stopping him in the hallways to talk about his performance. Some asked if he gave piano lessons. Others wanted to know if he would play at their parties or events. A few even asked for his autograph, which made David laugh because he felt like the same kid he had been that morning. But as David walked to the bus stop at the end of the day, he realized that something fundamental had changed. He was still the same person, but the way people saw him, and the way he saw himself, was completely different. When the old school bus pulled up and the doors opened with their familiar screech, David climbed aboard with a lightness in his step that hadn't been there that morning. As the bus pulled away from Riverside Academy, David looked back at the school that had seemed so intimidating just a few weeks ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since starting at this school, David felt like he truly belonged. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable Friday afternoon, and David's life at Riverside Academy had completely transformed. Walking through the hallways now felt like moving through a different school entirely. Students who had once ignored him now waved and called out his name. Teachers smiled when they saw him coming, and the music room that had once felt forbidden was now like a second home. David pushed open the door to the music room and smiled at the familiar sight. There was Mrs. Wellington, working with a small group of students on their scales. When she saw David, her face lit up with genuine warmth. Perfect timing, David, she said. I was just telling these students about the importance of practice and dedication. Would you mind sharing how you developed your technique? It still felt strange to David, being asked for advice by Mrs. Wellington, but over the past few months, they had built a relationship he never could have imagined. After her apology that day, Mrs. Wellington had made a real effort to change. She had become one of his strongest supporters, helping him prepare for auditions and encouraging him to push his musical boundaries. The most important thing my grandmother taught me David said to the group of younger students, was that music isn't about being perfect. It's about telling a story with your heart. One of the students, a shy girl named Rebecca, raised her hand. But what if people don't like the story you're telling? David thought about that question. 6 months ago, he would have been terrified of people not liking his music. Now he understood something different. Then you keep telling it anyway, he said. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear exactly what you have to say. After the lesson, David sat at the beautiful grand piano that had once seemed so intimidating. Now it felt like an old friend. His fingers found the keys easily and he began playing a new piece he had been working on, a composition of his own that blended the classical techniques Dr. Anderson had been teaching him with the soulful melodies his grandmother had shared. The music room had become David's sanctuary. During lunch breaks, students would often gather around the piano to listen to him play. Some would request their favorite songs, and David had gotten good at playing almost anything by ear. Others would just sit quietly and let the music wash over them. "That's beautiful," came a voice from behind him. David turned to see Principal Roberts standing in the doorway with a visitor, a woman in an elegant coat carrying a briefcase. "David, I'd like you to meet Ms. Chen from the Metropolitan Music Conservatory," Principal Roberts said. "She heard about your performance at our spring showcase and wanted to meet you in person." David's hands trembled slightly as he stood up from the piano bench. The Metropolitan Music Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. He had looked it up online after Dr. Anderson mentioned it, but he never dreamed someone from there would actually come to see him. "Hello, David," Ms. Chen said with a warm smile. "I've heard some incredible things about your musical abilities. Would you mind playing something for me?" David's mouth went dry. This was different from playing for his classmates or even performing at the showcase. This woman represented opportunities he had only dreamed about. "What would you like to hear?" he asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Whatever speaks to you," Ms. Chen replied. "I'm not here to judge your technique, though I'm sure it's excellent. I want to hear your musical voice." David sat back down at the piano and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his grandmother, about all the afternoons they had spent together making music. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the fear, the humiliation, the triumph, and the growth. When he began to play, it was the piece he had been working on just moments before. But now it felt different, more personal, more important. He let his emotions flow through his fingers, telling the story of a boy who had learned that his differences weren't weaknesses but strengths. As the last notes faded away, Ms. Chen sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. Then she smiled and pulled a folder from her briefcase. "David, I would like to offer you a full scholarship to attend our summer intensive program," she said. "It's a 6-week program where you would study with some of the best piano teachers in the world. If you do well there, we would very much like to discuss your future with our institution." David stared at the papers she handed him, unable to believe what he was reading. A full scholarship. 6 weeks of intensive study. The chance to work with world-class musicians. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Say yes," Principal Roberts said with a grin. "This is an incredible opportunity, David. You've earned it." Later that afternoon, David found himself back in the music room with Dr. Anderson and Mrs. Wellington. The news about the conservatory scholarship had spread quickly through the school, and both teachers wanted to make sure David understood what a big deal this was. "Less than 50 students are selected for this program each year," Dr. Anderson explained. "Students from all over the world audition for these spots." "And they came to you," Mrs. Wellington added, shaking her head in amazement. "David, do you realize how extraordinary that is?" David was still processing it all. 6 months ago, he had been afraid to even touch this piano. Now he was being offered opportunities that most music students could only dream about. "There's something else," Dr. Anderson said, looking pleased with himself. "I've been talking to the administration about starting a new program here at Riverside. We want to create a music mentorship program where advanced students like you can work with younger kids who might not otherwise have access to quality music education." You mean like kids from my old neighborhood? David asked. Exactly like that, Mrs. Wellington said. We've already gotten approval to bring in students from 3 different elementary schools. They would come here twice a week for lessons and group sessions. David thought about all the kids he had grown up with who had never had the chance to touch a piano like this one. Kids who had incredible potential, but no opportunities to develop it. I would love to be part of that, he said, without hesitation. 3 weeks later, David stood in the same music room where his journey had begun. But now he wasn't alone. 12 kids from local elementary schools sat around him, their eyes wide with excitement as they looked at the beautiful grand piano. Who wants to learn how to make this piano sing? David asked with a smile. A dozen hands shot up in the air and David laughed. He thought about his grandmother and how proud she would be to see him passing on the gift she had given him. Among the group of kids was a little boy who reminded David of himself at that age. Quiet, observant, and clearly fascinated by the music. David made a mental note to spend extra time with him. The first thing you need to know about music, David told the group, is that it doesn't matter where you come from or what you look like. Music only cares about what's in your heart. As David began teaching the children their first simple melody, Mrs. Wellington watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes. She had learned something important from David, that talent and character had nothing to do with address or appearance. That lesson had made her a better teacher and a better person. The music filled the room, simple and pure, as 12 pairs of small hands learned to make beautiful sounds together. David smiled as he listened, knowing that somewhere, his grandmother, was listening too, proud of the man he was becoming and the gift he was sharing with the world. Outside the music room windows, other students passed by and stopped to listen. Some pressed their faces against the glass, watching David work with the children. The boy who had once been an outsider was now at the center of something beautiful, a bridge between worlds, proving that music really could bring people together and change lives in ways no one could predict. The piano that had once been a symbol of everything David couldn't have had, become the instrument of everything he could give.